Greetings to all our viewers tuning in to our channel. There are moments in a nation's history that don't arrive with the roar of cannons, that don't shake city squares with mass protests, and that don't make the front page with bold, dramatic headlines. They come quietly, wrapped in the guise of technical meetings, budget spreadsheets, and jargon-laden reports. Yet, decades later, when all the noise has faded, it's these very moments that reveal themselves as pivotal turning points, when a country, either by design or by default, chooses the path it will follow for generations to come. Canada's decision on the future of its fighter jet fleet is one such moment. At first glance, it seems like a simple story. Replacing the aging CF-18s, a routine procurement process familiar to the political life of any nation. But the deeper we dig, the more the technical facade peels away, exposing a much larger and weightier question. Will Canada enter the next 3 decades as a nation that truly commands its own military strength, or as a dependent link in the very defense system it belongs to? In the 21st century, power is no longer measured solely by the number of weapons or the size of a defense budget. It lies in the ability to control technology, in the right to make independent decisions in operations, and in whether a nation can use its military capabilities when it deems necessary, not merely when it's granted permission. And this is precisely where this seemingly technical decision starts to look more and more like a test of sovereignty. The backdrop makes that test harsher than ever. The international order is shifting, alliances are no longer immutable, and the Arctic, once a distant, frozen periphery, is emerging as a central arena of strategic competition among world powers. For Canada, this is not a far-off front line, but a direct survival space where security, economics, and territorial sovereignty intersect in a fragile balance. In such a context, every defense decision does more than just protect the skies. It exposes the political resolve and strategic confidence of the entire nation. One path offers immediate comfort. It's familiar, low disruption, and preserves smooth relations with allies. But that path also comes with invisible ties that grow tighter over time, from technology and logistics all the way to the final say in decision-making. The other path is rougher, demanding steadfastness in the face of diplomatic pressure and disapproving glances from abroad. Yet it opens the door to reshaping Canada's industrial, military, and strategic sovereignty in the long term. History has never favored nations that shy away from difficult choices. And as Canada stands at this crossroads, the question is no longer which aircraft to buy, but how far the country is willing to go to defend its own decision-making power. Because once a choice is signed into action, its geopolitical consequences will extend far beyond the hangar, reaching across Canada's position in a rapidly shifting global order. From that point on, the story moves beyond the narrow scope of a defense procurement deal, entering a tougher arena where interests, power, and geopolitical pressure intertwine. And here we are forced to confront how a technical decision has been thrust into an unofficial showdown between global power centers, where Canada is no longer just a buyer, but a player in a much larger game. If everything had gone according to the textbook of defense management, the process of selecting a replacement for Canada's CF-18s should have been nothing more than a cold, technical financial equation. Teams of experts would sit down to compare range, payload, cold weather combat performance, life cycle costs, and NATO compatibility. A mid-sized country with a tradition of transparency would base its decision on data and long-term interests. But reality rarely follows such a clean-cut path. The moment Ottawa signaled it needed a comprehensive reassessment of the F-35 program, the atmosphere around the decision changed instantly. Technical discussions gradually gave way to political messaging, closed-door phone calls, and quiet warnings, subtle but unmistakably clear. This was no longer just about aircraft. It had become a test of how much freedom Canada truly has in shaping its own defense architecture. Washington's response revealed the core of the issue. Instead of a peer-to-peer dialogue between allies about strategic needs, economic and trade levers began to surface in the background. The message wasn't written down, but everyone understood. This defense procurement decision was inseparable from trade relations, supply chains, and Canada's position within the US-led security ecosystem. When an internal military choice becomes tied to the threat of economic retaliation, the line between cooperation and coercion starts to blur. This was the moment when defense procurement morphed into geopolitical confrontation, not with declarations of war, but through subtle signals of power. Canada was forced to ask itself, if this much pressure is being applied just during the selection phase, what happens in the next 10, 20, or 30 years of operation? When the two countries' strategic interests no longer align, will true control still rest in Ottawa's hands, or in decisions made elsewhere? The issue isn't that the US is bad and Sweden is good. International politics doesn't operate on simple moral terms. The issue lies in the structure of power. When a country owns the technology, the logistics chain, and system controls, it also holds political leverage, whether it admits it or not. And when Canada weighs its options, it's not just comparing aircraft specs, it's measuring how much autonomy it is willing to trade for strategic convenience. At this point, the story takes on deeper shades. It's no longer a choice between two manufacturers, it's a choice between two security models. One model places Canada as an end user within a closed ecosystem controlled by a major ally. The other opens up the possibility for Canada to become a more vocal, empowered player in its own military capabilities, even if it means facing friction and pressure on the diplomatic stage. As the spotlight of global politics shines on Ottawa, the comfort of technical spreadsheets begins to fade. This decision is now scrutinized as a quiet declaration of Canada's place in a changing world order. And to truly understand why the debate has grown so heated, we can't stop at diplomatic messaging or political reactions. We have to return to the eye of the storm, the F-35 itself, a symbol of American technological might, but also the focal point of every concern Canada faces about cost, control, and the strategic dependency at the heart of this choice. When the name F-35 is mentioned, it almost instantly evokes a kind of technological aura: stealth, sensor fusion, cyber warfare, multi-domain operations. On paper, the F-35 isn't just a fighter jet. It's a symbol of how the United States envisions modern warfare. For many allied nations, owning the F-35 is seen as a golden ticket into the elite club of 21st century aerial combat. But it's precisely at this point that the gap between image and reality begins to show. Because power on paper doesn't automatically translate into sustainable capability in the day-to-day realities of military life. Beneath the F-35's high-tech exterior lies an extremely complex system, where every component is tightly woven into a logistics chain, software architecture, and a centralized control structure. U.S. audit reports, years of congressional hearings, and the lived experiences of the U.S. Air Force have repeatedly pointed to an uncomfortable truth. The F-35 isn't nearly as seamless as advertised. Lower than promised readiness rates, lengthy repair times, and ballooning maintenance costs, these aren't side issues. They are factors that directly determine a nation's actual defensive capability. For Canada, a country with vast territory, a sparse network of air bases, and a harsh operating environment, every hour an aircraft sits idle in a hangar, waiting on parts or a software update, is a very real security gap. But cost and reliability are only the tip of the iceberg. The F-35's heaviest burden lies deeper in the way it's designed to operate. The F-35 isn't a standalone asset. It's a node in a network controlled by the United States, where data, software, and maintenance chains all pass through gateways Canada does not hold the keys to. Ottawa doesn't own the core source code. It cannot freely modify the system. It cannot make independent upgrade decisions without Washington's approval. This creates a dangerous paradox. Canada may own the plane, but not the full capability it represents. In ideal conditions, with smooth political relations, the system runs efficiently. But in the real world, where trade, diplomacy, and security are increasingly entangled, technological control becomes a form of political leverage. A single policy shift, a bilateral dispute, or a shift in U.S. strategic priorities could impact Canada's operational readiness without a single shot being fired. This isn't a hypothetical fear. Real-world examples of parts being redirected according to U.S. priorities or software updates being delayed have already made the power structure of the F-35 ecosystem clear. And when Canada signs on to a 30-year program, it's not just buying jets for today, it's locking itself into a dependency structure for an entire generation of officers, engineers, and pilots. The deeper you look, the more the F-35 reveals itself as a double-edged sword. It offers deep integration with the US and NATO air forces, but it also binds Canada's security to the political will of another great power. Strategic convenience in the short term comes at the cost of long-term sovereignty. And it's at this point that the question shifts from how powerful is the F-35 to what is Canada willing to trade to have it. As the glow of technological prestige fades, space opens up for other choices. Not perfect ones, not promises of absolute superiority, but options that prioritize mastery, sustainability, and the idea that a nation should not just use its weapons, but fully understand and control them at every level. It is within that space that a fundamentally different approach begins to emerge. Not loud, not pressured, but one that speaks directly to Canada's most pressing concern: how to move from the role of customer to that of a true partner in shaping its own military strength. In a landscape where the F-35 emerges as a closed system, laden with control mechanisms and dependencies, the arrival of the Gripen E presents the outlines of an entirely different philosophy. It doesn't enter the debate with flashy declarations of absolute superiority, nor is it accompanied by ultimatums or backroom pressure. Instead, the Swedish proposal quietly raises a more fundamental question. Does a nation buy fighter jets to possess an aircraft, or to build national capability around that aircraft? The Gripen E was born from Sweden's own strategic context. A small country bordering major powers, unable to rely on sheer numbers or massive budgets, and therefore forced to treat sovereignty and self-reliance as existential principles. That's why the Gripen wasn't designed to rely on complex global supply chains. It was built to function in isolation, with limited resources, and under constant political pressure. Surprisingly, this philosophy aligns far more closely with Canada's reality than most technical comparison charts would suggest. The core of Saab's offer doesn't lie in selling a plane, it lies in sharing control. Canada is not positioned as a mere end user, but invited to become part of the Gripen ecosystem. Access to source code, the ability to integrate weapons independently, the freedom to decide on upgrade roadmaps, features typically considered sensitive in major arms deals, are put on the table as the foundation for partnership. This redefines the very nature of defense spending, from paying for capability to investing in the creation of capability. For Canada, the implications of this approach extend far beyond the military. A domestic assembly line, a nationwide maintenance and upgrade network, and thousands of engineers and technicians trained to a high standard. These assets don't just serve the Air Force, they become strategic resources for the economy. In this scenario, defense is no longer a sunk budget line, but a driver of high-tech industry, research and development, and long-term sovereignty. Canada doesn't just operate the Gripen, it understands it, masters it, and can adapt it to its own needs without asking permission. More importantly, the relationship between Ottawa and Stockholm in this scenario is one of partnership, not dependency. Two countries of similar size, both committed to international law and with no ambitions to dominate one another, create a foundation for collaboration that is far less asymmetrical. That doesn't eliminate geopolitical risk, but it does significantly reduce the chances that a foreign political decision could paralyze Canada's military capability. Of course, the Gripen E isn't a promise of perfection. It doesn't carry the aura of a trillion-dollar weapons program, nor is it surrounded by the marketing glow of a next-generation warplane like the F-35. But that humility is precisely what makes it practical. The Gripen is designed to fly often, repair quickly, adapt flexibly, and survive in scenarios where outside support may not always be available. For a country like Canada, with vast territory, a scattered population, and an enormous patrol responsibility, those are qualities that can't be overlooked. The deeper the analysis goes, the more the Gripen appears not as a decision made in opposition to anyone, but as a decision made for oneself. It reflects a desire to shift from the role of passive buyer to active builder, from short-term convenience to long-term sustainability. But every argument about technology, industry, or sovereignty must ultimately face an unavoidable test. the harshest operational environment Canada must defend. Because when all the debate leaves the warm meeting rooms of Ottawa and steps out into the real world, it will face ice, snowstorms, and the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the North. In the Arctic, where infrastructure is scarce, the weather is brutal, and supply chains are fragile, every theory of power, every promise of technology will be pushed to its limits. And there, the question of which aircraft truly suits Canada will no longer be a political issue. It will become a matter of strategic survival. Every theory, every technical blueprint, and every promise of power must ultimately face the real world. And for Canada, there is no more decisive real-world environment than the Arctic. This is not just a remote stretch of land on the map. It is a space of strategic survival, where harsh climate, vast distances, and sparse infrastructure force every military system to reveal its true limits. The Arctic has no patience for what is complex, dependent, or fragile. For decades, the Arctic was seen as Canada's quiet buffer, a region where military presence was more symbolic than strategic. But melting ice, newly opened shipping routes, and the growing presence of Russia, China, and other powers have transformed this space into a genuine strategic battleground. Here, the challenge is not to defeat an adversary in a large-scale air battle, but to maintain continuous presence, respond quickly, and defend sovereignty in an environment where even the smallest mistake carries a steep price. It is in this context that the differences between systems begin to sharpen. The Arctic demands aircraft that can take off from short, sometimes makeshift runways, operate reliably in deep sub-zero temperatures, and be maintained by small, dispersed crews. Every hour an aircraft is grounded for lack of parts, every canceled flight due to oversensitive systems directly erodes airspace control. This is where on-paper perfection quickly gives way to the practical question: will this system still function when everything around it is working against it? Any platform that relies on complex infrastructure and an intricate logistics chain is at a clear disadvantage in this environment. Not because it's less advanced, but because it was designed for a different kind of warfare, one where large bases, dense support networks, and constant connectivity are taken for granted. Canada's Arctic is the opposite. There, dispersion, flexibility, and self-sufficiency aren't luxuries. They're the conditions for survival. The Arctic story also exposes a strategic paradox. Canada has one of the largest airspaces in the world, but it cannot defend it with symbolic deployments alone. Sovereignty isn't affirmed through declarations, but through constant presence, through silent, repeated patrols. And to maintain that presence, the critical factor isn't having the most powerful aircraft, but having aircraft that can fly often enough, consistently enough, and long enough to make a real difference. Here, the Arctic forces every calculation to return to some very down-to-earth questions. How many hours can you fly per year? Is there enough budget to sustain a regular patrol rhythm? Are pilots being trained regularly in real conditions, or just in simulators? When your strategic theater spans thousands of kilometers, readiness is no longer about moments of brilliance. It's about the endurance of the entire system. And it is from the Arctic's harshness that an unavoidable truth emerges. No matter how sophisticated a Northern defense doctrine may be, it is ultimately bound by budget and operational sustainability. No nation can maintain a lasting presence if the cost per flight hour exceeds what it can bear. When the ice settles and the maps are folded away, the final question isn't which jet is more advanced, but which jet Canada can afford to fly often enough to truly protect its skies. And from there, the debate must shift to a less glamorous but no less critical battlefield, the cost per flight hour, where the budget is not just a number, but a direct determinant of a nation's ability to fight. In military affairs, there is a dry but unforgiving metric, often obscured by slogans about next-generation superiority, the cost per flight hour. It lacks the glamour of stealth technology, doesn't stir the imagination like dogfights on screen, yet it determines one core truth: whether an aircraft actually flies. And for Canada, a country tasked with defending a vast airspace stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific and deep into the Arctic, this question is a matter of survival. In theory, a modern fighter only needs to be very powerful at the decisive moment. But in reality, security is not built on rare moments of action. It's built on thousands of patrol flights, on hours of quiet training, and on the ability to respond instantly when a radar picks up an unknown signal. Every flight hour cut due to budget constraints isn't just a number erased from a spreadsheet, it's a gap opening up in the sky. The disparity between platforms here becomes impossible to ignore. When the cost per flight hour of the F-35 is many times higher than alternative options, Canada faces a strategic paradox: owning a more advanced aircraft but being forced to fly it less. Fewer training hours mean less experienced pilots. Fewer patrols mean broken presence. And in a strategic space as vast as Canada's, that absence isn't a small detail, it's a systemic risk. No matter how large, a defense budget is never infinite. Every dollar funneled into high operating costs is a dollar not spent on training, infrastructure maintenance, or investment in supporting capabilities. Over time, financial pressure doesn't just throttle flight tempo, it begins to shape the mindset around force usage. The aircraft becomes a precious asset, deployed only in critical scenarios, instead of a tool for continuous presence. And when that shift occurs, nominal power begins to separate from real-world capability. By contrast, a platform with lower flight hour costs doesn't make flashy headlines, but it allows an Air Force to do the most essential thing: fly. Fly enough to train to proficiency. Fly enough to patrol with consistency. Fly enough to turn sovereignty from a line on a map into a lived reality. And in this context, the budget is no longer just a matter of saving money, it becomes the linchpin of sustainable combat readiness. The deeper we look, the more cost per flight hour reveals a hard truth. Military power doesn't reside in the peak of technology, but in the ability to sustain operations over time. An Air Force might win a simulated battle on paper, but lose the war of presence if it can't afford to keep flying. And when budgetary constraints start to determine who flies, how long they fly, and how often, the question of efficiency slowly turns into a question of control. Because when high operating costs force a nation into deeper reliance on suppliers, on logistics chains, and on decisions made elsewhere, the budget ceases to be a purely financial issue. It touches the final boundary of sovereignty. From that point forward, the debate can no longer stop at how much does it cost to fly an hour. It must go deeper, into the realm where control over technology, data, and upgrade decisions will ultimately determine whether Canada truly owns its military power or is merely renting it at an ever-growing price. In the 21st century, sovereignty is no longer measured merely by the length of borders or the number of soldiers standing guard. It lives in much more intangible realms: data streams, algorithms, software, and the authority to decide who gets to touch the brain of a weapons system. A nation may own dozens of modern squadrons, but if it doesn't control the core technology, that power is conditional. It only fully exists when political relations are favorable and can be curtailed the moment the balance of interest shifts. Technological sovereignty, therefore, becomes the final line between an autonomous military force and one that functions only with permission. In next-generation weapon systems, hardware is just the shell. The true value lies in the software that controls it, in the ability to integrate sensors and weapons, and in the authority to update or modify how the system operates. When those elements are beyond the user nation's control, every long-term defense plan comes with an asterisk. For Canada, this question isn't academic. It's deeply tied to a geopolitical reality that grows more complex each day, where trade, security, and diplomacy are no longer separate domains. A trade dispute today can become a technical barrier tomorrow. A shift in strategic priorities across the border can quietly alter Canada's Air Force readiness, leaving Ottawa with few options to respond. In such moments, sovereignty isn't lost in a single declaration. It is eroded, silently, step by step. Technological sovereignty is also a matter of time. A fighter program doesn't last just a few years. It spans 3 decades or more. During that time, political generations will change, the global order will shift, and the stable assumptions of today may no longer apply. If control over technology is out of reach from the start, then any future adjustments become costly and reactive. Crucially, technological sovereignty doesn't mean turning away from alliances or rejecting cooperation. It means having the ability to engage in those alliances as an equal partner with clearly defined autonomy. A nation that owns its technology can cooperate out of shared interest, not out of necessity. And that subtle difference defines the boundary between a partner and a client, between a co-creator and a dependent. As the debate over Canada's next fighter jets nears its conclusion, what lingers isn't just technical specifications or marketing slogans about next-gen warfare. What remains is a deeper question. Does Canada want to enter the future as a nation that commands its own strength, or as a nation willing to let that strength be defined and limited by others? The answer, though signed as a procurement contract, is in truth a declaration of sovereignty in an age where power no longer always takes the form of guns and missiles, but hides in silent lines of code. When all the technical arguments have been laid bare, when budget numbers, life cycle costs, and tactical specifications have been weighed to the point where nothing remains hidden, the final question facing Canada is startlingly simple. It's not about which aircraft to buy, but about what kind of nation Canada wants to be in the decades ahead. Because every major defense decision never truly ends in a hangar. Quietly, it shapes a country's strategic posture, industrial architecture, and degree of autonomy in an unpredictable world. One path offers a sense of familiar security. On it, Canada integrates fully into an ecosystem led by a major ally, using the most advanced technologies and sharing capabilities with the world's strongest partners. But in return, control becomes fragmented and decision-making is constrained by political relationships and strategic priorities that don't always align. Power, in this scenario, functions like a premium service, efficient, convenient, but bound by terms Canada didn't entirely write. The other path demands more courage. It offers no instant perfection, nor immunity to diplomatic pressure or disapproving looks from abroad. But it opens the door for Canada to build, operate, and adapt its military capabilities on its own terms. Here, defense is not just an expense to mitigate risk, but a strategic investment in people, industry, and knowledge. Power is not bought off the shelf. It is created, accumulated, and mastered over time. History shows that the nations which preserve the widest space for autonomy are not always the wealthiest or most populous, but those that understand exactly what they depend on and take every opportunity to reduce that dependency. In a world where alliances are increasingly transactional, the ability to stand on one's own is no longer a luxury. It is a prerequisite for participating in the game on more equal footing. Canada's fighter jet decision, then, is not just a line in a procurement file. It is an unspoken statement about how Canada sees its sovereignty in the 21st century. Will it be a country that purchases prepackaged power to feel secure today, or one that chooses the harder road to create power aligned with its own identity and long-term interests? The answer won't only be read by today's policymakers, but by future generations looking back, asking why Canada ended up where it did on the map of global power. This debate shouldn't end in closed-door meetings or buried in technical memos. It needs to be made public, dissected, and discussed by the very people who will live with its consequences. What do you think? Should Canada buy power for immediate reassurance or invest in building its own strength for the long haul? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because every perspective helps clarify the bigger picture. If you found this kind of analysis helpful and want to keep following the strategic turning points shaping our world today, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support not only helps this channel grow, but helps bring serious conversations about sovereignty, security, and a nation's future to a wider audience.